You know, this program today, this is a big deal, and it's great that you're here for it, because I think we're actually going to make some history. There's some ground that's being covered here today that you've not had covered before. So we'll talk about that and shortly, and Len Cada and Martin Rowell and Mike Jones are going to do that for us. But the program that you're going to see today, that you're going to experience today, is something that you can't get really anywhere else. This is real history, lived by the gentlemen who are going to tell you about it, and who have experiences to share with you. As the academicians would say, we have primary sources here. That's who we have with Martin Rowell and Mike Jones. Martin Rowell was an apprentice at Jaguar. He was hired in by Sir William Lyons. He was there with people like Lofty England and Bill Haynes, and he was there for things like the horrible 57 fire at Browns Lane. He was there for the launch of the E-Type in '61. Later on in his life, had a distinguished career in the automotive industry in the world of brakes with companies like Teves and others, and is just a font of both technical, design, and managerial knowledge.
Together. But basically, if you have a chance to look at this picture here, this is in 1933 on the London to Land's End and London to Edinburgh trials of my dad in an MG Midget that was, I think, 760 cc's, and he was a rally enthusiast. And so he drove these. There were night rallies, which is interesting given the dodgy condition of lights in those days. But this particular, what I did, I contacted a motorcycling club in the UK who sponsored these rallies. The motorcycling club was founded in 1905, and anyway, I had these silver tankards, which and price of which he won, so I was curious. So anyway, I wrote away to them, and they sent me copies of the original program for that rally. It was a sort of little handout that every driver got. So thanks to my dad, he generated an interest. Well, he did all his own, he would grind his own valves in. He was actually a shoe salesman, but he had a Morris 8, which he bought he sold this in 1939, the MG, because I had just been born, and so he needed a roomy car, and World War II was probably coming. So he bought a Morris 8, two-door Morris 8, and traded in the MG for it. I have the original invoice at home, but with that car I would help him do brake linings and did mess around. So he engendered my interest in cars. And the next thing I want to draw your attention to is this diagram on the wall here. The yellowish, this is my student apprenticeship at Jaguar. And how that happened was that I left school at 18, and fortunately, one thing, if you did an apprenticeship then, you didn't have to do military service, which is another reason to have an apprentice. My parents suggested that. So this top left-hand document was, Peter Hollinshead actually found that and said, hey, you might be interested in this, Martin, which indeed I was. I really treasure this thing. It was an autocar advertisement from July the 2nd, 1954, training opportunities at Jaguar. And my dad, having been a car enthusiast, he said, hey, that'd be really something, you know, for you to do. So why don't we go ahead and send it? So the letter in the middle, I've written there, the most important letter of my life. It set these wheels in motion where I wrote to Jaguar from, I was at boarding school then, and they said, we've received your letter and please come and have an interview. And so, in other words, I had passed the right examinations on graduating from high school, and you needed math and physics and amongst other things. And so I had this very interesting interview.
eventually 12 of us were invited to Coventry, and there was Sir William Lyons, there was Lofty England, there was Thurston, the chief financial officer, and the service manager, and basically, if you had any material with you, I was always doodling and drawing cars and stuff, so I took that with me. Cut a long story short, the letter on the right there was my, from August 56, accepting me as a student apprentice and telling me to turn up on September the 10th, 1956, at the house, the large house you see on the bottom right, in the middle of that, it was the student hostel, which Jaguar had purchased some years before, where we would spend generally Sunday evening to Friday evening, and it was close enough to the factory that we could either ride a bike there or walk there, and so that was the Hollies there, and this was a remarkable. We spent typically in an apprentice like that. Mike did the same thing. You would start off with 6 months in the engineering shop, learning how milling machines work and set it up. You would be in the paint shop. You would generally go in every department in the factory, into purchasing, into the sales department, and generally learn how the factory works. The goal being for Jaguar that hopefully you would stay with the company afterwards and do good things. Was not to be necessarily. I hope I did good things, but the other thing shows that the double-decker bus in the middle was the bus that I went to and from my home in Leicester. And interestingly, Mike and I grew up. He's a year and a half older than me. We actually grew up within 3 miles of each other, but never knew it, which is quite remarkable. And a picture of when I went home at the weekend, a picture of my mum and me, and she filled me up with my favourite puddings and stuff. So that was that one there. And so we had, it was a great experience being an apprentice. And we would have the task of sometimes a picture in the middle bottom was showing 2 parliamentary officials in the government in the UK doing tours of the factory. So we were seconded. You have to show them around the factory and see how the system works. So at the time, an important thing, a major thing happened there, which was this: in February '57, there was a fire at the factory, and it was believed to have started in the paint shop, and nobody quite knew why. But 1,500, these are the original paper cuttings which I kept, and it was they lost about 280 cars, and interestingly, I was there at the time when the D-type was just being investigated. There were 16 D-types only were converted to XKSS, which was the sort of street-going version of the D-type before the fire. And so the fire, it really was a seminal event, and we all sort of helped clear the thing up. Also on this is a little ad for the Jaguar Apprentice Association. Mike belonged to a similar thing at Roots, I believe. Yeah. And these are we published these magazines. They came out about 3 times a year, and we actually got really interesting people to write articles. One of the most interesting ones was Sterling Moss, wrote an article for the 52 millimeter. Now, does everybody know what the millimeter was? Yes. Okay, the 1,000 kilometers around Italy, and it was, Mike mentioned the Dunlop disc brake. Jaguar was just developing the disc brake, and it was run with a C-type Jaguar, which had been fitted with Dunlop disc brakes. And Sterling Moss's co-driver was Norman Dewis, who was the diminutive chief test driver of Jaguar. If you saw a picture of Norman Dewis, about 5'4", and Lofty England, who was 6'6", at least the bucks for the cars made sure that the seat runners and the foot room were covered from the short to the tall. So that was an amazing race, and the brakes worked wonderfully, and it was a real sort of getting the teething troubles out of the Dunlop disc brake. Now this is before the Maxarette. The Maxarette, the anti-skid device, came a little bit later, but Dunlop was very prominent in that. So that's the sort of a core of life as a student apprentice. And I say we were exposed to customers. They would come in, we would be seconded. We wore green uniforms so we wouldn't get lost, and we're sort of shown around. And it was a real treat. I used to stay up with my all night for the Le Mans 24-hour race, listening to the racing. And what was really interesting was to see the evolution of the D-type over here. Basically, the D-type was an evolution of the C-type, and we take this one here. The C-type Jaguar, I said, in 1952, when Moss ran, it was the first race with disc brakes. It established their superiority, particularly at Le Mans. And there were 3 cars that Jaguar entered in that race. Unfortunately, they all overheated, but they did at least attempt to finish the Mille Miglia, which had always been the great proving ground for Ferrari and Lancia. It was an Italian. Others could join in if they felt like it, but it was, to me, the most amazing race ever. And in 53, the lessons from 52 had been learned, and Jaguar finished 1st, 2nd and 4th with the C-type. And and then in 53 came a very interesting. The C-type was really clearly good, and Jaguar had an amazing stylist and designer called Malcolm Sayer, who was an American who had come from the aerospace industry, I believe. But anyway, he ended up with Jaguar, and he was the one who took the C-type and they built one in October 53 called the CD prototype, and we had a perspex bubble over the cockpit. And they took it to Belgium because there were no motorways in Britain at the time. So the only place you could near to Britain was you went across the channel on the ferry, and from Ostend to Brussels was the Jabeka motorway. It was finished just before World War II, and it was a fairly narrow 2-lane motorway, and you can still drive on it today. And that car averaged 178 miles an hour for a flying mile. Which was an astonishing speed. It had a long axle ratio, 2.88 to 1, so the revs didn't go too high. And Norman Dewis drove it, particularly useful because he had a low frontal area, being only 5'3". But so he was underneath this bubble, and so they did this race. And so for me, again, being in the factory, I was aware of this happening, and it was really interesting. And then the D-type, was first tested in April '54, again by Norman Dewis on the then new motor industry research track near Coventry. For those who've been to England, it's called MIRA, is the acronym for it. It's now owned, I think, by Hitachi. It's owned by a Japanese company now, but in those days it was for the British car industry. And then in '54 there was this Le Mans 24-hour race again. 3 ran and 1 finished 2nd in his first race, and behind a Ferrari, only 105 seconds after 24 hours. And the Jaguar was running on the Mulsanne Straight at 172. So, and then you've got this extreme going down the Mulsanne Straight at Le Mans. At the bottom you've got to do this essentially 90-degree turn. So every lap you had this enormous load on the brakes. And for those who remember pictures, Mercedes at that time, because they were slow in adopting the disc brake, they had this air brake. Behind the driver, a panel would pop up, and it was essentially this wing large area. And it gave an astonishing sort of, it almost jolt you in a slowdown. I read about that. And but Jaguar did finish well that year, and at Reims. And so 55, coming up to 55, I finished my apprenticeship in 56. But Le Mans 24-hour race, the 3 D-types ran, and two finished first and third. But that was when they had that terrible multi-car accident and fire, which really put a damper. It forced Mercedes to withdraw from racing, and there was a terrible accident there. I remember hearing it on the radio. And then the most amazing, next year in 56, at Le Mans 24-hour, 6 Jaguars ran, 3 from factory and 3 private cars, and they finished 1 to 4. It was at the year end, the factory disbanded the cars and they were sold to the Écurie Écosse, a Scottish team who was ready to run the cars. In January 57, just before the fire I talked about, they were started to convert the unsold D-types into XKSS. I mean, they're magnificent. I think they sell for, 30-40 million now, if you can get one. But it's an astonishing, it's a wonderful car. I did drive a C-type once, but I never drove a D-type. But and then in 57 was the grand finale. 4 teams of D-types ran 5 cars, and they finished 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6. So it was an amazing fanfare of that vehicle. Now, in this time, I'd been there were rumours about the E-type being developed, and so that was taking part very strongly. Just as a matter of interest, the C-type, 53 were built, so Jaguar built 53 C-types. They built 71 D-types, of which a large number got destroyed in the fire. And of the E-type, a total of 72,000 were actually built. So it gives you an idea of what took off. And a key driver for that market was the American market, actually, because there was they simply felt it was the right car. And just historically, going back a bit, because I've got the whole pedigree here, of the XK 120, 140, 150, those 3 cars built between 49 and 58, they built 30,300. So of the whole of the 120, 140, 150, that was the result of that. Okay, I've got details on that if you're interested. So getting involved in the E-type was really exciting, and the first body was called E1A, and it was based on a D-type, and amazingly it had a 2.4 litre 4-cylinder version of the 6-cylinder XK engine. They thought, well, at that time they were changing the rules of racing. It was 2.5 litres unsupercharged, I think, and 750 cc's if you wanted to do that, supercharged. And it had independent rear suspension, which was unique. And they decided after 2 years of testing to keep the 6-cylinder engine, but enlarge it to 3.8 litre. And then going back to coming to 59-60, a second one with the new rules, with 3 litre engines, and but then they went back to the 3.8 litre. Interestingly, there's the E2A, which ran at Le Mans. It's a really unique vehicle with a hood streamlined with a fin tail. It was rescued by the Woodley and Griffith families. Now, Roger Woodley was an apprentice with me at Jaguar, and his family were fairly well heeled, and the car, they got it from, I don't know how they got it from the US, but anyway, it's in the Camden collection. It was in the Camden collection in the UK, and in 2008 it was sold to a Swiss owner, and it ran in a Le Mans 50th anniversary race in 2010. So that's a really interesting E-Type sort of prototype. But the 1961 Geneva show, that's where the E-Type really was introduced to an enormous fanfare. It was really interesting in as much as it had huge teething troubles, which were hidden. In those days there were no recalls. It was a glorious time. The factory was desperately printing service bulletins, which was the nearest thing you could get to a recall. And as a service engineer, which I had become in 1960, I was going around to dealers, giving them more or less like I am now, with an overhead projector, if you were lucky. You need to do this and do that. And one of the more embarrassing issues with the very first cars, they tended to be bought in Germany by wealthy lawyers who wanted to say, well, I'm bored with Mercedes and BMW, I want something interesting. And it couldn't have been to a more difficult customer base, but one of them was the fuel tank got the wrong gasket. The fuel pump and on top of the tank in the tail, and the gasket failed, and so the tail of the car filled up with petrol. The E-Type has got this, the body, got the spare wheel well. The initial fix was at least make sure that the paint drainage plugs are out. So if there was a leak, at least the fuel could run out at the bottom. Obviously, the factory came very quickly up with a proper gasket to fit over the fuel pump. But then a particularly awkward one was that the torsion bars of the E-Type suspension had a torsion bar going to the rear, and just if it had a multi-tube square tube frame. It's like a subframe at the front, and from the dash rearwards was a sort of a monocoque steel body. And the torsion bar abutments, the torsion bars were about this long from the lower wishbone, and so they would obviously have a very strong force going this way. And the trouble was that where these torsion bars were fixed to two very sturdy brackets just to either side of the clutch housing, those tubes were flexible, they were bending, they were being stressed so much by the torsion bar load that they said, God, we've got to do something. What can we do? Because we're right alongside the clutch and gearbox. There's no room, we can't do anything. And miraculously, there was space between the flywheel and the front, the end of the end of the clutch at the beginning of the gearbox, where a transverse plate, it was cut out with a welding torch if you could do it and then fit it. But basically, it took the two torsion bar abutments with two bolts, joined these bolts with this plate about this thick, and so it went across underneath the frame. And so all the load of the torsion bars doing this and doing that was taken by this plate, which miraculously fitted. You didn't have to take the engine out. You could actually pull it, slid up, just be in alignment, and they had fitted bolts, and so that's the sort of thing I was having to talk to the dealers about and try and keep them calm and do it.
And the reaction. The reaction.
Well, the reaction was, thank God you've done something.
No, I mean they called it the reaction plate.
Yes, the reaction plate. That's probably the name for it, reaction plate. But it was a positive reaction, I must say. But so that was that one. And what was amazing as well is how the dealers would help themselves to make modifications. Some dealers did in fact offer a 5-speed ZF gearbox. That could be bolted on and it would fit. But because the Jaguar transmission was, yes, designed by Jaguar, built by Moss, but it had a non-synchromesh first gear, and so I would teach people how to double declutch to get into first, and so that was one of the things that you tried to do. But there were interesting times, And I now come to so that was the premiere, and the E-types, they could run at 150 miles an hour. That was their record. They said that in the print, but it really needed racing tires, really top quality racing tires, and they were produced by Dunlop, by Engelbert, and by another French company called Kleber Colombe. And it was called the V12. I think the tire was called V12, but there were tires available to do this. And another issue became with Belgian pavé, which was still very common in the 60s, late 50s and early 60s, as the name implies, in Holland and Belgium and German cities, with very stressful on wheels and undergear. And they discovered an issue with chrome wire wheels, with the spokes where they went into the hub had hydrogen embrittlement, a tendency for that. So therefore, with owners who had chrome wire wheels and they were having any issues with loose spokes, we would simply do a quick, I did it as a service engineer, to write the order, retrofit with painted wire wheels, not chrome wire wheels, and why don't you have the wire wheels, the color of the wire wheels match your upholstery. So a wonderful looking car was a black or dark green E-type with red wire wheels. I mean, it just looked gorgeous, and so cool. And it matched the red upholstery. So that was an issue as a young man which I had to sort of cope with. And if I look at the next release between 61 to 66, I was a service engineer, and seeing the terrible what's happening in Israel at the moment, I went to Beirut and Damascus mainly to cover the fleets which were owned by government. They had bought the Mark 10 Jaguar as fleet owners for high-ranking government people, and an issue with Arab chauffeurs was that they would never, when they would keep their foot on touching the clutch pedal. They didn't want automatics, and so if you push the clutch too far, it would be slipping. So there were trouble with slipping clutches. So you had to try and eventually the dealer would put a big sign up in Arabic saying, "Take your foot off the clutch pedal when you're not changing gear. At least do that." And it sounds simple now, but it was a big issue. And there was an issue as well, a serious one, with it was called Adwest power steering. It had a three-tooth sector, in a worm wheel at the end of the thing, and the thing which moved the track rod was essentially a third of a gear with three very massive teeth. And unfortunately, we found out at the factory that these teeth could get cracks, which was very embarrassing. So that was a recall of Adwest steering boxes, for which I went to Beirut to sort of supervise that. So they sent by air freight these heavy steering boxes, about 10 of them. There were 10 cars to deal with, and we dealt with it. So I mean, nowadays everybody knows about these, but there were wrinkles which made life. Being interesting is being a bit sarcastic, but so I come now to the 1966. This, by the way, this picture here is to me. Have I talked about moss in the Mille-Miglia? I think I did. But sterling moss in the Mille-Miglia is just amazing. This is a view of a typical road in the Mille-Miglia. People lined, all leaning forward to see what's coming, and so. That's what that one is here. The next vehicle I wanted to cover, I found this. Who knows of Pasteiner's bookstore in Birmingham? Oh, good. Okay, great. Okay. Thanks to Pasteiner's, I found this one there about a year ago, and this is the new Jaguar 2+2, which is the XKE with seats for four. So it had the extended seats and a high, sort of a high windshield and that sort of thing. And so a friend and I, we were tasked, wonderful task, at the Geneva Motor Show in '66 of driving the cars from Coventry carefully to Geneva just in time for the press show, and then during the press drives making sure that they got treated right, and the Geneva distributor, the Swiss distributor, he looked after the cars at night and did oil changes, that sort of thing. But it was scary at times because the people wanted to say, wow, the motorway was open in Geneva to Lausanne, the new freeway, and so they could really rocket down there at high speed. And again, the interesting thing, it's a very personal thing, is that at this Geneva Motor Show I had the good fortune to meet my wife to be, and our first date was in one of these cars, and
So cool.
In hindsight she has said to me, had I driven like a lunatic with that car, there would never have been a second date. So anyway, that's a
cool.
small story. But we drove the cars there and drove them back to the factory. One problem was where the pipes were running underneath the rear subframe. They were already oval for clearance, but we were on the French roads with these undulating roads. It were very easy to sort of nearly flatten the tailpipes there. But so that was an interesting segment. And please feel free to look at any of these things you want. What I've got on the wall over there is, don't need to turn around, but the car in the middle is the WIPL1, was Peter Lind. I was, as mentioned, I became service manager for Jaguar in Germany, and Peter Lind was the owner of the company, and he lived in Wiesbaden, and he raced for the factory in '63 and '64 and won the European Touring Car Championship. And that's a picture of the carousel corner on the Nürburgring, and it's slightly exaggerated, and there's a photograph on the right, you can't see here now, but the Swiss distributor was an amazing guy. They were really, they would get so frustrated, the distributors, because they would complain about the shortcomings of the car, and the answer would typically be, well, how many cars do we sell in Switzerland a year, or in Germany a year? 400, 350. We sell 5,000 in America, but we're not going to bother. But these dealers would go out of their way to come up with wrinkles. For instance, these guys in Switzerland, they retrofitted oil coolers at their own expense. If an owner had like an XK150 and really liked it, and he was going to buy an E-Type, they said Jaguars had trouble with hot oil, so they would retrofit an oil cooler, make a new sandwich plate between the oil filter and the side, and they would do usually stiffer shock absorbers. They would retrofit Koni. It was getting popular then, Koni shock absorbers, and so that's a picture of Peter Lind there, and the picture of the guy, that was a year before he passed away on the right. It's a little photograph of the service manager, who was an amazing guy. He taught me how to ski when I first went there, and he was obviously quite young. And he had an E-Type steering wheel, which he gave to me in 2013. So now I have the wheels hanging up at home, but so I have a lot of sentimental feeling for that. And then the middle photograph there is sort of a summary of, again, the evolution of the Jaguars through the years. So I guess that's basically what I wanted to explain today, and it was a fascinating life, and it put me in good stead for doing other things. And I came to Allied Signal when I left Jaguar in '67 and joined Alfred Teves, which then the German braking company. They had the Lockheed license, even in the 30s. So when Mercedes was racing in the 1930s, Mercedes and Auto Union, Alfred Teves was delivering a hydraulic brake booster and also was delivering Lockheed hydraulic seals, the pattern for the German pre-World War II race cars. So that was Alfred Teves, and then they were taken over in 1969 by ITT. At that time, Henry Ford and Harold Janine, who most of you know the name, he was the head of ITT. Ford they'd met somewhere, and Harold Janine suggested to Ford, hey, Ford, why don't you sell brakes in America? We could use your smaller European brakes on our cars in America. So as a result of that conversation in 1976, we got transferred for 3 years to the US, and so I was working for Teves there, and the main customer was Ford. As mentioned, it became the Ford Fairmont, and we actually only did the vacuum booster and the front brake, and we were competing with Kelsey Hayes and Bendix and Delco Moraine for other items. And Bosch was in fact the first to introduce ABS brakes in America on Mercedes, but we were the first, the Lincoln Continental 1974 model was the first car to have Teves anti-skid brakes. And so I stayed with that company, stayed with the Teves Continental group, and then went to Allied Signal, and that was in a few years later. And I retired in 2004, so have stayed in America. My 3 years in America became 20, and so became American citizen in '87, and so I enjoy the time with the Mobility History Committee, and it's great to have a chance to meet you guys today.
Thank you, Mark.
Quick question. Does Martin have time?
Couple of questions.
Couple of quick,
Mark.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Talk to us about driving a C-Type.
Driving
And the first time you saw the E-Type, your reaction as a young man.
Okay, well the first time when I saw the E-Type, I did not actually, I sat in the C-Type, I didn't drive one,
Okay.
but when everybody first saw the E-Type, they were severely sort of covered up. They would transport them to Myra in a truck so that people wouldn't see it, but no, I think when people saw you see my face in that picture down there, I was hunky-dory. But it had the E-Type suffered from terrible, not only the petrol issue. When you opened the front door, the water would pour off the scuttle into the car. So water leaks were an issue, and
But it was breathtaking, right?
it was breathtaking. It was breathtaking. No, it was. Yeah. And it was a great privilege. I look back as a young man to have driven other people's fast cars. So therefore, I never had the need to buy a fast car of my own. It was I got spoiled. Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Thank you for sharing.
Okay.
You mentioned that driving to Geneva in '66.
66.
I'm pulling up a vague memory. Wasn't there a very famous fast drive to get the first E-Type to Geneva?
That one.
To get to the show.
Yeah, that's what he was talking about doing himself.
No, I did the second show.
Yeah.
No, it was Bob Berry, a guy called Bob Berry, who was PR, head of PR. He drove the first E-Type in '61. He had to get that. He drove it overnight from the UK. It's a dramatic story, and because the last thing he had to do was have an accident or get stopped by the police. But he got it to the Geneva in time for the press day at the '61 Geneva
But
Motor
see,
Show.
you were-
This was
Within
66.
minutes, I think,
That's what
Martin.
I'm thinking.
It's within minutes.
Within literally
They just had time to wipe it down.
Yes, that's right. It was amazing. Yeah, and
That's right, 66 was like that too.
no. 66 was casual. Yeah, we just had to. My colleague and I, two of us, we had a car each. A red one, a green one. We had to keep inside of each other and make sure we didn't bend anything.
So that wasn't standard operating procedure at Jaguar to do it for the last one.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yes.
Would you care to crack open the locomotive folder just briefly?
There you go. Train
yeah.
engineer. Trains.
Yes, sure. Yeah, I'm happy to do that briefly. Well, first of all, I'm a proud member of the Durand Railroad Museum and Archive, and they're going to get. I've got about 2 running meters of railway books, and so again, I inherited this from my dad. My dad was a train spotter, even before the Second World War, and so he would go to stations and write in a book train numbers, collect train numbers basically. And so I inherited that to some degree from him, and then I've always been fascinated in speed, of record speed for railway locomotives. And there was this amazing thing in 1938. I was born 2nd of July 38, and on the same day, the Mallard, it's a famous British streamliner, just broke the world record of 126 miles an hour in Britain. And about 5 days previously, the Germans had claimed the world steam record about 1.5 miles an hour slower. However, the German record was on a flat track between Hamburg and Berlin, and the British record was on a very slight, like 0.1% downgrade. And people still argue, well, is it? But because steam died out in the 1950s, it won't be beaten again. But to me, there's nothing to compare standing alongside an 8-foot set of drivers and imagining those all the side rods and stuff. A 700-pound side rod doing about 400 RPM. I mean, it's enormous, the hammer blows, and you see the track out here today. I mean, it's amazing. They've done a wonderful job of doing the track here. So, and I just have to share with you my all-time best experience on a train was on the high-speed rail line from Frankfurt Airport to Cologne. Those who've been to Frankfurt, don't leave Frankfurt Airport without doing the day trip to Cologne and back. The ride. And it goes on 3% slopes, so 180 plus miles an hour. And the latest ones, unfortunately, you can't sit at the front and look through the window. But there wasn't, in 1995 to about 2000, you could sit behind the driver, and I've done this at night, going back from Cologne to Frankfurt. I would delay trips to get on the train and sit behind the driver, tap on his window, he said, come and sit next to me. So there he was with the windshield here, and you're going through tunnels, my hair's standing on end as I talk about it. It's a double track, and at night, and you can see the curve going through the tunnel this way, and you feel the train bottom out at the bottom of the thing, and you feel it lift off slightly at the top. Now, that to me is my equivalent of owning a 1938 Aston Martin. But anyway, I end with that.
Great story.
Thank you,
Well, I just wanted to say one thing with tongue in cheek. This guy's too much of a gentleman to remind us all that you say Jaguar, not Jaguar.
Right.
Jaguar.
I'll have to make one thing with Len, thank you for bringing it in there.
You can see this in movies, you can read these books, but I think to get the personal input of the people that were there is priceless. So.